July 25, 1944, 4:18 a.m., south of Caen, France. Major David Curry of the South Alberta Regiment watched through binoculars as German tanks moved into position near the village of Saint-André-sur-Orne. His squadron of 17 Sherman tanks represented part of the Canadian 2nd Armoured Brigade, committed to Operation Spring, an offensive designed to break German defences and open the road to Falaise. Intelligence had suggested moderate opposition. What Curry observed was heavy armour, dug-in positions, and defensive preparation that indicated the Germans knew exactly where the Canadians would attack. Behind Curry, the soldiers of his regiment were experienced veterans of Italy and the Normandy invasion, but they were about to face some of the most elite formations in the German military. Elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, equipped with Tiger tanks and defended by experienced crews who had spent weeks fortifying positions. The coming battle would test everything the Canadian Army had learned about combined arms warfare, and by day's end, the results would force both German and Allied commanders to reassess their assumptions about Canadian military capability. The question of Canadian military capability in World War II is more complex than simple narratives of heroism or sacrifice suggest. Canada entered the war in 1939 as a nation of 11 million people with a regular army of approximately 4,500 soldiers. By 1945, Canada had mobilized over 1 million men and women in uniform, deployed forces across multiple theaters, and participated in some of the war's most critical battles. But capability involves more than numbers. It requires examining training quality, tactical doctrine, equipment, leadership, and most importantly, combat effectiveness measured against the most capable opponents. The story begins not in 1944, but in 1939, when Canada declared war on Germany 1 week after Britain. The delay, though brief, was symbolically significant. Unlike World War I, when Canada automatically entered war as part of the British Empire, 1939's declaration was an independent Canadian decision. This political independence would be matched by growing military independence as the war progressed, with Canadian forces increasingly operating under Canadian command rather than simply supplementing British formations. But declaring war and fielding a capable army were vastly different challenges. The Canadian military in 1939 was tiny, poorly equipped, and lacked the institutional capacity for modern warfare. The equipment was largely obsolete. Much of its surplus from World War I training facilities were inadequate for even the small regular force, let alone the divisions Canada would need to raise. Industrial capacity for military production was limited, and the military's institutional knowledge had atrophied during 2 decades of peacetime neglect. The transformation from this hollow force to an effective fighting army took years and was driven by painful lessons learned in combat. The first test came at Hong Kong in December 1941, where 2 Canadian battalions were sent to reinforce the garrison with minimal training and obsolete equipment. The Battle of Hong Kong was a disaster. Canadian forces fought bravely, but were overwhelmed by Japanese forces in 18 days of combat. Of 1,975 Canadian soldiers sent to Hong Kong, 290 were killed in combat, and another 267 would die in Japanese POW camps. The survivors endured 3.5 years of brutal captivity. Hong Kong revealed catastrophic failures in Canadian military preparation. Soldiers had been sent into combat with inadequate training, some having fired their rifles only a handful of times. Officers lacked combat experience and realistic tactical training. Equipment was obsolete, ammunition was limited, and coordination with British and Indian forces was minimal. The defeat was militarily inevitable and politically devastating. It forced recognition that fielding an army required more than recruiting soldiers and shipping them overseas. Effective military forces required systematic training, modern equipment, and institutional competence that Canada lacked in 1941. The disaster prompted reforms. Training programs were overhauled, with emphasis on realistic combat scenarios rather than parade ground drill. Equipment modernization accelerated, with Canadian industry beginning to produce modern weapons rather than relying on imports. Officer selection emphasized competence over social connections, gradually professionalizing the officer corps. These changes took time, and Canadian forces would continue learning through combat, but the institutional commitment to building an effective military intensified after Hong Kong. The Dieppe raid in August 1942 provided another brutal lesson in what modern warfare demanded. The raid, planned by British Combined Operations Headquarters, sent 5,000 Canadian soldiers to assault the French port of Dieppe in an operation that was catastrophically flawed from conception. German defenders, forewarned by intelligence failures and observation of rehearsals, were prepared and dug in. The Canadians landed and were immediately caught in defensive fire that turned the beaches into killing zones. Of 4,963 Canadian soldiers who participated in the raid, 3,367 were killed, wounded, or captured. The casualty rate exceeded 68%, one of the highest losses in any single operation in Canadian military history. Entire battalions were effectively destroyed. The Royal Regiment of Canada suffered over 95% casualties. The South Saskatchewan Regiment lost its commanding officer and most of its senior leaders in the first hour. German defenders, fighting from prepared positions with interlocking fields of fire, massacred Canadian infantry caught in the open on exposed beaches. The tactical failures at Dieppe were numerous and well documented. Intelligence was inadequate. The plan assumed surprise that wasn't achieved. Naval gunfire support was insufficient. Air support couldn't suppress German defenses. Tanks landed on beaches, couldn't climb the seawall and became stationary targets. Communication between units broke down immediately. Command and control collapsed as senior officers were killed or lost contact with their units. The operation was a comprehensive failure at every level of military planning and execution. But Dieppe, despite being a tactical disaster, provided crucial lessons that shaped Allied planning for D-Day. The need for overwhelming fire support was recognized. The importance of specialized equipment for beach assaults was demonstrated. The necessity of detailed intelligence and realistic planning became undeniable. Canadian military leadership, analyzing what went wrong at Dieppe, incorporated these lessons into training and doctrine. The soldiers who survived Dieppe and later fought in Italy and Northwest Europe were shaped by understanding what not to do, knowledge purchased at terrible cost, but invaluable for subsequent operations. The Italian campaign, beginning with the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, marked the maturation of Canadian military capability. The 1st Canadian Infantry Division and 1st Canadian Armoured Brigade, landing alongside British and American forces, faced German and Italian defenders in terrain that favoured defence. The fighting in Sicily demonstrated that Canadian forces had learned from previous failures. Their performance, though not without problems, was competent and occasionally excellent. The advance through Sicily saw Canadian units capturing objectives on schedule, coordinating effectively with supporting arms, and demonstrating tactical flexibility when plans broke down. At Agira, Canadian infantry assaulted heavily defended positions in mountainous terrain, taking casualties but achieving objectives through determination and improving tactical skill. German commanders, evaluating Canadian performance in Sicily, concluded that these were capable troops who fought aggressively and couldn't be easily dislodged once committed. The Italian mainland campaign tested Canadian forces more severely. The advance up the Italian peninsula involved continuous combat against German defenders who used terrain expertly to slow Allied advances. Canadian units fought at Ortona in December 1943, in what became known as Little Stalingrad for the intensity of urban combat. The battle lasted 8 days, with Canadian infantry clearing the town house by house against German paratroopers who were among the Wehrmacht's best troops. Ortona demonstrated evolved Canadian tactical capability. Infantry used combined arms techniques, coordinating with tanks, engineers, and artillery to reduce strongpoints systematically. Mouse holing, blowing through walls to move between buildings without exposing troops to street fire, became standard practice. Canadian soldiers adapted to urban combat's unique demands faster than doctrine prescribed, showing initiative and flexibility that characterized effective military forces. The Germans were eventually forced to withdraw, recognizing they couldn't hold against sustained pressure from troops who had learned to fight effectively in the most difficult terrain. By 1944, Canadian forces fighting in Italy were veteran formations with institutional knowledge of modern combat. They understood how to coordinate infantry, armor, artillery, and air support. Their officers had combat experience and knew how to adapt plans when contact with the enemy disrupted carefully prepared schemes. Soldiers knew how to survive under fire and how to kill effectively. These weren't the untrained troops sent to Hong Kong or the inadequately prepared forces massacred at Dieppe. These were professional soldiers who had learned their trade through bitter experience. The invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, saw the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division assault Juno Beach as part of the largest amphibious operation in history. Unlike Dieppe, the D-Day planning incorporated lessons about fire support, specialized equipment, and realistic intelligence. Canadian forces landed under massive naval and air bombardment. Specialized armor cleared obstacles and suppressed defenses. Engineers breached obstacles systematically. The operation worked as planned, with modifications for the inevitable chaos of combat. Canadian forces on Juno Beach penetrated further inland on D-Day than any other Allied force, advancing approximately 9 miles from the beaches and capturing objectives, including the crucial Carpiquet airfield. This success reflected superior training, effective leadership, and institutional competence developed through years of painful learning. German defenders fighting Canadian units reported that these were first-rate troops who pressed attacks aggressively and couldn't be stopped by casualties that would have broken lesser formations. Battles after D-Day tested Canadian capabilities against Germany's elite formations. Operation Spring, the attack Major Curry participated in, saw Canadian armor and infantry attacking prepared positions defended by the 1st SS Panzer Division. The operation was poorly planned at higher command levels, with intelligence failures underestimating German strength and positioning. Canadian units advanced into killing zones where German Tigers and anti-tank guns destroyed tanks methodically. The 2nd Canadian Armoured Brigade lost 150 tanks in Operation Spring, approximately 60% of its strength. But even in defeat, Canadian tactical competence showed. Units under fire didn't panic or rout but maintained cohesion and fought back effectively. Major Curry's squadron, ambushed by superior German forces, organized a defensive position and held for hours against repeated counterattacks. Curry personally destroyed multiple German vehicles and coordinated his remaining tanks to prevent complete destruction of his unit. For his actions at Saint-André-sur-Orne, Curry would receive the Victoria Cross, recognizing not just personal courage, but the tactical skill that kept his unit functional under catastrophic circumstances. The German assessment of Canadian forces fighting in Normandy was that they were aggressive, well-trained, and difficult opponents. Captured German documents analyzed Canadian tactical methods and warned defending units that Canadian attacks were coordinated, supported by effective artillery, and pressed home even under heavy casualties. SS General Kurt Meyer, commanding the 12th SS Panzer Division, stated in post-war interrogations that Canadian troops were first-rate soldiers who attacked with determination and couldn't be intimidated by firepower alone. The battle for Caen and the eventual breakout saw Canadian forces in continuous heavy combat throughout July and August 1944. The 2nd Canadian Corps, under Lieutenant General Guy Simonds, developed sophisticated tactics for breaking fortified positions. Operation Totalize in August 1944 introduced night attacks by armored columns navigating by compass, using artillery to mark boundaries rather than traditional daylight coordination. The operation achieved partial success, demonstrating Canadian innovation in tactical doctrine. The closing of the Falaise Gap in August 1944 saw Canadian and Polish forces fighting to trap retreating German armies. The battles at Trun and Chambois were vicious, with German forces desperately trying to escape encirclement, while Canadian forces held positions against furious counterattacks. Canadian infantry and armor held under pressure that might have broken less experienced troops, preventing significant German forces from escaping and contributing to the destruction of German armies in Normandy. The advance from Normandy through France, Belgium, and into the Netherlands saw Canadian forces assigned responsibility for clearing the Channel ports and coastal areas. This wasn't a glamorous assignment. The ports were heavily defended, the terrain favored defenders, and German garrisons had orders to hold at all costs. But clearing these ports was strategically crucial for Allied logistics. Canadian forces methodically captured Boulogne, Calais, and eventually opened Antwerp, fighting through urban terrain and fortified positions with competence that reflected years of accumulated experience. The Battle of the Scheldt in October and November 1944 exemplified the difficult fighting Canadian forces specialized in. Opening the Scheldt estuary to allow supplies into Antwerp required clearing heavily defended areas in waterlogged terrain that negated Allied advantages in armor and mobility. Canadian infantry, supported by British forces, fought through flooded polders, across canals, and through fortified towns against German defenders who used terrain expertly. The casualties were heavy, the conditions were miserable, and the fighting received less attention than more dramatic operations elsewhere, but the strategic importance was critical. Canadian forces suffered over 6,300 casualties clearing the Scheldt, but they accomplished the mission. By November 1944, Antwerp was operational, providing Allied forces with the port capacity necessary to sustain operations into Germany. The methodical, professional competence Canadian forces demonstrated in this campaign reflected an army that understood combined arms warfare, could sustain operations under difficult conditions, and achieved objectives regardless of cost. The fighting in the Netherlands through winter 1944-19 saw Canadian forces engaged in continuous operations, liberating Dutch cities and towns. The liberation of the Netherlands was militarily necessary, but also politically significant, as the Dutch population was facing starvation under German occupation. Canadian forces advanced through difficult terrain against determined German rearguards, liberating cities including Groningen, and eventually accepting German surrender in the Netherlands in May 1945. The final assessment of Canadian military capability must consider several factors beyond simple combat effectiveness. Canadian industry produced enormous quantities of military equipment, much of it for British and Allied forces as well as Canadian units. Canada built over 800,000 military vehicles, 16,000 aircraft, and numerous ships. This industrial contribution, while less dramatic than frontline combat, was crucial to Allied victory. Canadian training systems, refined through years of war, produced competent soldiers and officers. By 1944, Canadian replacements arriving at frontline units were better trained than the veterans they replaced had been at equivalent experience levels. This continuous improvement in institutional training capability reflected organizational learning that characterized effective military systems. Canadian tactical doctrine evolved throughout the war, incorporating lessons from failures and successes. By 1945, Canadian formations operated with combined arms coordination that matched or exceeded other Allied forces. Artillery support, which Canadian forces emphasized throughout the war, was particularly effective. German defenders consistently noted the weight and accuracy of Canadian artillery as a significant factor in Canadian tactical success. Leadership quality varied, as it did in all armies, but the Canadian Officer Corps by 1944 included numerous competent battlefield commanders. Lieutenant General Guy Simonds was recognized as one of the war's more innovative corps commanders. Major General Chris Vokes commanded the 1st Canadian Division with aggressive competence. At lower levels, officers like Major Curry demonstrated tactical skill under pressure that characterized effective military leadership. The casualty statistics tell part of the story. Canadian ground forces suffered approximately 42,000 killed during World War II, with another 54,000 wounded. These casualties, representing approximately 10% of those who served in the Army, reflected the intensity of combat Canadian forces experienced. The casualty rate was comparable to British forces and lower than Soviet forces, but higher than American forces in Europe. Canadian forces fought in some of the war's most difficult battles, often assigned difficult objectives, and their casualties reflected this demanding service. But casualties alone don't measure capability. More important is mission accomplishment. Canadian forces completed assigned missions throughout the war with increasing competence. They captured objectives, held positions under counterattack, and conducted operations that achieved strategic goals. By 1945, Canadian forces were trusted with independent operations and given responsibilities that recognized their proven capability. The comparison to other Allied forces provides context. Canadian forces were smaller than American, British, or Soviet forces, but operated with similar capabilities by 1944. British commanders generally regarded Canadian divisions as equal to British formations, and planning allocated them equivalent tasks. American commanders had less direct experience working with Canadian forces, but where they did, assessments were positive. German commanders, whose evaluations weren't influenced by Allied politics, consistently rated Canadian forces as high-quality opponents who fought aggressively and effectively. The tactical innovations Canadian forces developed influenced broader Allied doctrine. The night armored attacks pioneered in Operation Totalize influenced subsequent operations. The urban combat techniques developed at Ortona were studied by other units facing similar challenges. The systematic approach to clearing fortified ports informed planning for other siege operations. Canadian contributions to tactical doctrine were proportional to their size, meaningful but not dominant. The equipment Canadian forces used was largely British or American, with some Canadian-produced variants. The Ram tank, designed and built in Canada, never saw combat as a tank, but its chassis was used for other armored vehicles. The decision to equip Canadian forces with proven Allied equipment, rather than developing unique Canadian designs, was pragmatic and reflected realistic assessment of industrial capabilities. Canadian soldiers fought with Lee Enfield rifles, Bren guns, Sherman tanks, and other standard Allied weapons, ensuring logistical compatibility and reliability. The air-ground coordination Canadian forces developed was particularly effective. By 1944, Canadian infantry and armor could call on responsive air support that arrived quickly and struck accurately. This capability reflected both improved communications technology and refined procedures developed through experience. German defenders facing Canadian attacks learned to expect airstrikes shortly after ground attacks began, forcing them to disperse or dig deeper than they might against forces with less effective air coordination. The question of Canadian capability ultimately depends on what metric is used. In terms of raw numbers, Canadian forces were small relative to the major powers. In terms of industrial production, Canada exceeded its size through efficient mobilization. In terms of combat effectiveness, Canadian forces by 1944 were professional, competent, and capable of complex operations against first-rate opponents. In terms of strategic impact, Canadian forces contributed meaningfully to Allied victory, though they weren't individually decisive. The evolution from the hollow force of 1939 to the effective army of 1945 reflected institutional learning capacity that characterized successful military organizations. Canadian forces learned from failures, adapted doctrine based on experience, improved training continuously, and developed the professional competence that military effectiveness requires. This transformation wasn't inevitable. It required leadership that acknowledged failures, systems that incorporated lessons, and willingness to change when evidence showed current approaches weren't working. Major David Curry, whose Victoria Cross at St. André-sur-Orne exemplified Canadian tactical competence under fire, survived the war and returned to Canada. His actions demonstrated what Canadian forces had become: professionally competent soldiers led by officers who understood modern warfare, fighting with determination and tactical skill that forced even elite German units to respect them as dangerous opponents. The transformation from Hong Kong's disaster to Normandy's success represented 5 years of painful learning, institutional development, and sacrifice that built an effective military force from a nation with limited military tradition. The legacy of Canadian forces in World War II influenced Canadian military development for decades. The recognition that professional military forces require sustained investment, realistic training, and institutional competence shaped post-war Canadian forces. The understanding that small forces could be effective if properly trained, equipped, and led influenced Canadian military doctrine through the Cold War and into contemporary operations. The historical assessment must acknowledge both achievements and limitations. Canadian forces weren't super soldiers who won battles through individual superiority. They were professional soldiers who learned to fight effectively within Allied combined arms doctrine, contributing meaningfully to operations that achieved strategic objectives. They faced elite German formations and achieved mixed results, sometimes winning decisively, sometimes suffering heavy casualties, but always fighting with competence that reflected their training and experience. The question, how capable was the Canadian Army in World War II, has no simple answer. Incapable in 1939 and 1941, learning in 1942 and 1943, professionally competent by 1944, and effective in 1945. The trajectory from disaster to capability reflected institutional learning, investment in training and equipment, and the bitter lessons learned through combat. By war's end, Canadian forces were among the Allied Army's reliable formations, trusted with difficult missions, and capable of executing complex operations against determined opposition. The soldiers who served in the Canadian Army during World War II transformed themselves from civilians with minimal military background into professional soldiers who fought alongside, and sometimes exceeded the performance of armies from nations with long military traditions. This transformation was purchased with over 42,000 lives, countless wounded, and the psychological scars carried by those who survived. Their service built an army that was capable not through rhetoric, but through demonstrated performance in combat against the war's most capable opponents. The Canadian Army of 1945 bore little resemblance to the force that entered the war in 1939. It had grown from 4,500 to over 730,000 personnel. It had evolved from an ill-equipped, poorly trained force into professional formations that operated effectively across multiple theaters. It had learned from catastrophic failures and developed into an army that Allied commanders valued and German commanders respected. This capability wasn't inherent or inevitable. It was built through sacrifice, learning, and determination that characterized Canada's military contribution to Allied victory in World War II.